Hello, and welcome to Encounters with Polish Literature, brought to you by the Polish Cultural Institute, New York. I'm David Goldfarb, and I'll be your host. Marek Hłasko, one of Poland's colorful mid-century James Dean figures, whose fiction and memoir have enjoyed a revival in English translation in recent years, is on the agenda for today. One of the reasons I like reading and teaching Hłasko, aside from his sense of rebellion, his dark humor about the ironies of an otherwise grim life under communism in the 1950s and 60s, and the natural talent for plot that emerges in his best work, is that it makes a case for a question we're often asked in the academic humanities. Why study literature, or for that matter, art history, music history, especially in the context of a program in political history, the social sciences, or interdisciplinary programs such as area studies. When we're dealing with serious topics like the aftermath of the Second World War, growing up in Warsaw after its extensive destruction and constant reconstruction during Hłasko's lifetime until his exile, the Cold War, Soviet domination, what does literature or art tell us that we cannot glean from economic and demographic data or the historical record? I think that Marek Hłasko's work gives us, and if you're like me, us means people who did not live in mid-20th century Poland and who have studied Polish as a foreign language, a sense of the internal consciousness of life in the Polish People's Republic, or PRL, as it's usually called, Polska Rzeczpospolita Ludowa. How did time unfold in that era when the government was preaching a religion of progress, but people felt an increasing sense of stagnation, corruption, and fear of a police state as it became more and more entrenched? What was it like to live among the physical and psychological ruins of the war and the Holocaust in the decades after 1945? If someone out of desperation or opportunism was turned into an informant or a criminal by the Germans, for instance, how hard was it to slough off that internal moral compromise and resist becoming an informant or a criminal under communism? Hłasko's writing comes to prominence in the era known as the Thaw of 1956, 3 years after the death of Joseph Stalin, when the official doctrine of socialist realism in Poland, the Soviet Union, and the rest of the Warsaw Pact countries was relaxed. Fortunately, the era of socrealism is relatively short in Poland, compared to the Soviet Union, where the model was Maxim Gorky's Mother, published before the revolution in 1906, and the doctrine was formally declared in 1934 at the First All-Union Congress of Soviet Writers. It's this: socialist realism is the basic method of Soviet literature and literary criticism. It demands of the artist the truthful, historically concrete representation of reality in its revolutionary development. Moreover, the truthfulness and historical concreteness of the artistic representation of reality must be linked with the task of ideological transformation and education of workers in the spirit of socialism. End of quote. Literature was supposed to have an ideological intention to promote the idea of communism. Sometimes political speeches were reprinted verbatim in the context of a novel, in the mouth of one of the characters, or playing on the radio within the work. Hłasko does this ironically in the 13th chapter of his novel The Graveyard. Stalin called writers engineers of human souls. The problem was that reality in its revolutionary development was not reality at all, but at best an ideal that the communist government hoped to achieve with the completion of subsequent 5-year plans. Soviet writer Andrei Sinyavsky called it socialist classicism. So socialist realist fiction was about workers, miners, collective farms, and the solution to engineering problems. Some of it was a hybrid of fiction and journalism, and it was influenced by the perspective of cinema. And some of these modernist formal features carried over from the era of socialist realism into the literature and film of the Thaw. But we'll see that the ideological message changes as writers like Marek Hłasko express disillusionment with communism. Before we meet our guest, I'd like to thank everyone who has been following along with Encounters with Polish Literature, and to welcome newcomers to our series. If you like what you hear on this program, hit the thumbs up down below, click the bell to get notifications about new episodes, follow the playlist of all our episodes in the YouTube description of the program, leave a comment if you can, and please click the subscribe button to show the Polish Cultural Institute New York that you are interested and would like to hear more about Polish literature, its past and present, here on Encounters with Polish Literatures. George Gasyna was born in Łódź, Poland, and emigrated with his family to Canada at the age of 11. He holds 2 degrees in Slavic Studies from McGill University in Montreal and a PhD in Comparative Literature from the University of Toronto. He is currently Associate Professor of Slavic Languages and Literatures and Comparative and World Literature at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where he also holds faculty appointments in the Program in Jewish Culture and Society and the Unit for Criticism and Interpretive Theory. Professor Gasyna is author of Polish Hybrid and Otherwise, Exilic Discourse in Joseph Conrad and Witold Gombrowicz, published by Continuum in 2011. And he is editor for the volume Joseph Conrad's Polish Soul, Realms of Memory and Self, published in Lublin and New York by Columbia University Press in 2016. He wrote the introduction to Marek Hłasko's 1964 novel, All Backs Were Turned, translated by Tomasz Mirkowicz, and reprinted in 2014 by New Vessel Press in New York. His articles have appeared in a number of journals, including Slavic Review, Canadian Slavonic Papers, Polish Review, and Russian Literature. He is presently completing a book treating 20th and 21st century Polish provincial and borderland fiction. For 2020 to 2025, he has been appointed Conrad Humanities Professional Scholar in the College of Liberal Arts and Science at his university, an award that recognizes promising mid-career researchers in the humanities. Welcome, George.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you for hosting this series. Thank you for inviting me to talk about Marek Hłasko.
Thanks for joining us, George, especially to talk about Hłasko, who has enjoyed a revival in English in recent years, largely thanks to the efforts of Ross Ufberg, a former graduate student in the Columbia Slavic Department who co-founded New Vessel Press, specializing in literature and translation with Michael Wise, and published his translation of Hłasko's memoir, Beautiful Twentysomethings, with Northern Illinois University Press, which has been very prolific in its output of Polish literature and translation in recent years, as we discussed in our earlier episode on Zofia Naukowska. But aside from Ross's efforts, why do you think we should be interested in Hłasko now with this flurry of reprints and new translations? You've been working on Hłasko for many years. Why Hłasko?
Doing Hłasko, being interested in Hłasko, is in a strange way very liberating because of his kind of uneasy position in the Polish canon, the literary canon, right? His writing is kind of fits in a strange way across the canon. He was a writer who enjoyed actually several moments of great interest and then a kind of disappearance, and it's almost generational. So actually I picked up a Hłasko, of a collection of essays and stories in the early 90s when I was traveling in Europe, and I found this writing extraordinarily different than the other texts that I had been sort of getting introduced to, and somehow both very familiar and very foreign, and so I started thinking of Hłasko in terms of the stages of his writings, and there are 3 stages, I think, that at least to me that are kind of discrete, and each of these stages ask different questions or have different problems that are animating the writings, right? So there is this bad boy, the enfant terrible, the wunderkind of the regime, sponsored, promoted, brought into the spotlight, enjoying this meteoric rise as the approved critic of state socialism, right? So that happens during the thaw, just after Stalin's death, the first stage. these amazing headlines in the newspapers coming out of the truck driving school into literature, right? The son of a washerwoman who becomes a famous writer.
There's a great passage in Beautiful Twentysomethings about this period where he says he's writing reports for the Communist Party daily, Tribuna Ludu. And then he says, "One day they called me into Tribuna Ludu and gave me a prize, a novel by Anatoly Rybakov called The Drivers. I'll never forget it. It was the first socialist realist novel I'd read. I have to admit, I was struck dumb. So idiotic, I said to myself. Even I can do it. So I started."
Right, and that's of course the element of self-creation that's also there. That's maybe another element of the whole persona. How does he start exactly? Right, that's always the question. There've been these missing fragments that have been rediscovered laterally in the last few years. But the general ethos is socialist realism, the production novel, right, and a kind of mild critique of the system, which grows during the 50s, right? Initially, it's maybe the party secretaries can be corrupt, but only if they're running small town or small initiatives, right? The system itself is not corrupt. It's the people in it, and they're corrupt in sort of very human ways, all too human, right? Some drivers are drunks. The trucks are constantly failing, and there's corruption, but no different than anywhere else, right? And so that's the first stage, the promotion machine that kind of elevates him as this official angry young man, right? A Polish rebel without a cause, a Polish James Dean. This is sort of fed by a kind of a culture industry that is looking for criticism from within, and he fits that role, right? And that comes to an end. So the first stage comes to an end, and he's expelled from the country. He's kicked out. Suddenly, he's no longer the boy wonder, but indeed the prima donna of 1 week, right? One of the headlines. As soon as he became persona non grata.
What year was that?
1957, 58, right? He leaves on a state-approved visit to Paris, and there he causes his text Cmentarze, the Graveyard, to be published in Paris with Instytut Literacki, right? The Jerzy Giedroyć initiative, the Literary Institute. So as soon as that becomes available, he no longer exists in Poland, right? So the second stage, which I found very interesting, very distinct from the first one, but stemming from it, is that of the exile, right? The banished. And the disappointed lover, which I think kind of refers us back to Miłosz, right? Like the person who, I mean, Miłosz is speaking about Borowski, of course, right? Within Poland of the late 40s, from captive mind. Here we have the disappointment of being expelled, right? Of being sort of discounted, from being destroyed, and there's this great love for maybe even the persona that he created, right? And the disappointment of being suddenly cast out. So we have the exile, the banished 25-year-old writer. And then what I found interesting there in the context of my other work is how quickly and how fully he becomes enmeshed in the institutions of exilic life. And there particularly, I mean, Giedroyć's Maison Lafitte Institute, where Hłasko stayed on several occasions, right, in the back room, which was both the printing room and the sort of the hotel for Polish exiles. And then he starts reading the other stuff that the Institute is publishing. So he's reading Miłosz, he's reading Gombrowicz, right? He's reading these other texts that were kind of banned, right? And he benefits, I think, immensely for a time from this parallel universe of exilic institutions, right? And of course, I mean, I can't be sure now because my own copies, which are kind of behind us, were published, of Hłasko in Polish, were published in the 90s. But the first editions, certainly Cmentarze, but also Drugie Zabicie Psa, these were all published in Paris. So there's this institutional kind of adoption of Hłasko, right? And then the third stage, I think, moves us from this banishment, this disappointment, this sort of sense of the world that kind of disappeared under him, the gossamer world of being the bad boy socialist critic. All that is then transformed by a kind of really cosmopolitan sense of exile, right? If you put it on a timeline, there is Germany, there is Italy, France, of course, Israel, the States, and kind of back and forth traveling, this sort of peregrine Hłasko, making more and more contacts or reactivating other contacts that he had previously. For example, Roman Polanski, right, with whom Hłasko meets again in 1966 in LA. And then Krzysztof Komeda, famously Krzysztof Komeda, the episode of Krzysztof Komeda, whom Hłasko supposedly pushed off a cliff and caused his death. Komeda was sort of the quintessential European jazzman, right? But also a very good friend of Hłasko's, apparently. And there's this kind of throwaway line you see also in some of the letters. If Krzysiu dies, then I'll go too, right? And some biographers have been looking to connect the sort of tragic death of Komeda to Hłasko's own, and it's impossible to say now, but there's this strong connection. In the last stage, right, we have Hłasko visit the parts of the world where he got his earliest ideas. So Hollywood, right, LA, the sort of the American West, the desert, right, all the scenes that kind of feature so prominently in a Polish version in his earliest text. He goes to the original site, and he finds it a little bit different than he imagined it would be. And of course, it's looking a little bit different in late 60s than it did in the early 50s when he first encountered it. So these are the three stages, and each of these stages have Hłasko engage with different kinds of problematics, right? The first stage is really the in medias res, living socialism, the daily life of socialism, reflected in his stories, the production novels.
Rather than laying out the history and backtracking, why don't we look at that period right now? I'm thinking about the eighth day of the week, which was almost like a key to all of his later works. In the West, we often forget that Warsaw was totally destroyed during the war, and the 1950s, even the 1960s, are still very much a period of reconstruction. People are squatting in ruins, living in communal apartments while new housing is built, and there is a constant sense of waiting and deferral. The title of the work, The Eighth Day of the Week, is something that doesn't exist, that the characters are all waiting for, but that never arrives. The main characters in the novel are Agnieszka and Piotrek, girlfriend and boyfriend, and they're looking for a space to have sex. It has the form of a socialist realist production novel, but they're not building a hydroelectric plant or pouring the foundation of a steel factory. It's two lovers looking for some privacy. Agnieszka doesn't want it to be a tawdry or public space, or in their apartment with her parents and their lodger in the next room. Piotrek thinks he can use a friend's apartment while he's away, but that doesn't quite work out, and it's always about having this desire that's never realized, this plan that's never fulfilled, to use the terms of early communism. I think you identified an interesting passage about that unrealized desire.
There are actually two passages. The first one kind of sets it up in terms of just how crowded everybody is and how you can't really have any privacy. The term doesn't exist, right? We were talking about ruins. So this sense of enforced togetherness creates a kind of paranoia where people are suspecting each other. The logic of communal apartments very quickly becomes a kind of nightmare. And so this is a family scene in Agnieszka's apartment with her parents. "I'll study in the kitchen," said Agnieszka. She gathered up her books and walked to the door. Before going out, she stopped. "I'm sorry, Mother," she said slowly. "Sometimes my tongue runs away with me, and then I'm sorry." "Better watch out for yourself," her mother said. She gave another groan. "I'm sure you're going out with some good-for-nothing when you should be staying at home." She began to speak faster and with emphasis. "But I'm not going to set up a nursery here. Merciful Jesus, who could have foreseen all this?" Agnieszka gazed at her in silence and walked out. She went into the kitchen and turned on the light. The kitchen was small and cluttered. The beds took up a great deal of room. One belonged to her brother Grzegorz, the other to Zawadzki, a mechanic employed by the Warsaw Gas Works, who'd been staying with them since 1945, still waiting for an apartment of his own. She sat at the table and spread her books. With an effort, she read half a page. Then her father came into the kitchen. He stood in the middle of the room and cleared his throat, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. She looked at him questioningly. Agnieszka, what's the matter with you? He said. What do you mean? What's mother talking about? It's obvious. I'm a streetwalker. Tell mother I said so. Is that enough for you? Agnieszka, her father said imploringly. Agnieszka. He looked at her helplessly. I'm afraid Grzegorz will come to a bad end. He spread his hands. Why don't we understand each other at all? We understand each other perfectly, said Agnieszka. The poor woman's sick, the apartment's small, you earn practically nothing, and now go back to the living room, otherwise mother will suspect you of plotting something horrible with me. So that's the first quote. Just very hard to be rational when you don't have your own space.
What was the communal apartment?
The context here is the idea of the communal apartment, where in Warsaw and other cities, much of the urban infrastructure was completely destroyed in the war, in Warsaw in particular, during the Warsaw Uprising and what happened afterwards. And so before new housing units were built, the survivors were often crammed, perfect strangers in apartments that were in good shape, good enough shape to be habitable. And so you had perfect strangers living next to each other, occupying the floor space, if you like, right, for years on end, sometimes over a decade. And then the building phase of the new, what we call Wielka Płyta, right, the sort of apartments, the modernist style apartments, the bloki that we still have, that starts in the 60s and really takes off in the 70s, right? A kind of great leap forward, if you like, to move people into private spaces. But for the first 10, 15 years, people were living often with perfect strangers in a situation that didn't seem like it would ever resolve itself, right? Since mainly we're still at the stage of clearing ruins. So then the second phase, the second passage is when Agnieszka is taken to what turns out to be a squat, right? Another squat, another sort of living arrangement where they're hoping to get some privacy, a concept that's sort of hard to define at this point, but it really means that, there are no other people around, kind of crammed around you. So it sort of looks like this. She's walking along with Piotrek. Agnieszka looked into lighted windows and thought, walls, 4 walls, perhaps 3. Can there be a room with only 3 walls? Could one live in such a room? Is there such a room somewhere? She tried to think of different things, but one thought dominated all the others. She wanted to sleep, to fall asleep at last. She did not recognize the streets along which Piotr was leading her. She came back to herself only when he had led her through a doorway and they found themselves in a completely dark courtyard. She looked about her in surprise. Not a single window was lit. Why is it so dark here? She asked. Don't you see? He laughed. These are ruins. Only now did she notice that the windows were empty. She had not been able to see it at first. The windows barely stood out against the dark sky. Is this where you live? Well, we're the only tenants, he said. We fixed the place up for ourselves. We climbed up to our room, up a ladder. It's better than a circus. But that's unimportant. They're not in. Do you understand? We're alone, Agnieszka. Alone, she repeated. She suddenly put her arms around him and drew him to her. She began rapturously to kiss his eyes and mouth. Alone, alone, she stammered. Do you understand? Do you understand? She pressed herself to him with all her strength. At that very moment, a rectangle of light fell on them from above. She closed her eyes. Piotr pushed her away gently. They're back, he said. Only one window is ever lit here, mine. They raised, and this is sort of like a romantic, romantic sort of filler for something that couldn't really happen, right? They raised their heads and looked upward, high above them, over the window, the courtyard and the ruins. Stars gleamed through the mist.
Instead of 4 walls, they have 3 walls like a theater, and the spotlight is on them.
And if that doesn't give one performance anxiety, then I don't know what will.
Grzegorz is this persistent drunk, and Agnieszka is dragging him out of one bar and the next. But he wants to be a writer. So he's imagining writing a novel, and he says, In this story, nothing can be successful, which seems to be what the eighth day of the week is all about.
It's a novel production which doesn't produce anything, right? And it's sort of a metaphor for the decay of socialism, which is still growing in a way, but decaying at the same time. So you have these communal apartments, you have these ruins, you have the streets. There's a wonderful scene of the street which comes to life on payday, and it's not very different from like the passages of the proletarian streets in Orwell's 1984, right? It's the same idea, just drinking to oblivion, drinking to forget. And Grzegorz is one of the sort of professional drunks of Polish literature of this period, right? He can drink with the best of them and sort of survive to drink the next day. But he too has this almost Shakespearean idea of the existential malaise that everybody's stuck in.
Yes, maybe we can look at that Shakespearean moment.
Grzegorz is having this existential moment of crisis, and there are several different references to Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet, who could never meet in Warsaw, but particularly here, a more pointed, reference to Hamlet, of course, and how to exist in this world. So he is basically saying this, perhaps an allusion to Midsummer Night's Dream, actually. I don't want my life to be an illusion. I don't want to have to hide my love. And to begin with, I want to know what will become of Poland. What will happen to all those who are wronged, to the party, to freedom. I want to know what will happen to those who betrayed my confidence, to those who kept assuring me that I was fighting and winning when actually I was retreating, acting against the people, losing my faith and my conscience. You can hear your own voice in your throat, but your own life you can perceive only with your conscience. I want to find water to wash my hands in. Does it make sense to talk about love under such circumstances? Everyone has heard that there's such a thing, but what does it look like? What should it look like? How can we reconcile pure feelings with dirty hands? That's a problem, not the only one. Today, Hamlet, with his to be or not to be, would be just good enough to serve as errand boy for a small town party secretary. Life has smashed all preconceived patterns like so many clay pigeons. What are we to create to take their place? To be or not to be? People are exhausted. They are dropping to the ground. What can raise them up again? To be or not to be? Cynicism is coming, and fast, to be the sole morality. To be or not to be? Can anything valuable come out of a world that has to use blackmail to keep from collapsing? To be or not to be? Oh, we've created artificial moons, but man with his true feelings and aspirations must find a safe refuge. To be or... Waiter, half a liter, please. So again, this incomplete thought, incomplete process, nothing can be done, right? And there's already the stench of corruption and decay surrounding this project, the project of Polish socialism, right? The Polish road to socialism, which is what, 9-10 years in the making only at that point, right? So there's that kind of inability to really get through the day.
Connected to that, there's another scene with Agnieszka and her brother Grzegorz in a bar that shows an ironic completion. She filled his glass. When he raised it to his mouth, she grabbed his hand with her two hands and pressed it with all her strength. The glass cracked. Agnieszka squeezed her fingers ever more tightly and felt the fragments of the glass sinking into his flesh. He did not cry out. He only turned pale, and thick drops of sweat appeared on his forehead. Both watched his blood dripping on the dirty tablecloth. She squeezed her hands together so violently that her collarbone made a cracking sound. "Come," she said. He rose, still holding his hand, and without relaxing her grip, she led him through the room and out into the street. Only there did she let go of his hand. She staggered heavily and leaned against a wall. "Hit me," she whispered. He smiled. "That was very nicely done," he said. "I thought people had been entirely sterilized, incapable of such imagination. Man's strength always flows from cruelty. That is the basis. It's a pity you've revealed yourself so late. I might have got suitable work for you before. He walked up to her and raised her face. Come, little one, he said. Yes, let's go home. I'm beginning to like you for the first time. Breaking the glass in his hand is painful, but it's so off the scale and outrageous that it seems like the one moment of freedom in the novel. What do you think he means when he says, strength always comes from cruelty?
It reminds me of Gombrowicz, right? Where Gombrowicz in his diary, around the same time, says that all great art comes from conflicts, from decay, from cruelty, from sadism, right? And then you see this also in Hłasko later, the same thought, right? Where he talks about, think of the time of the Borgias or the various wars of the roses, and you have this amazing art that came up at this time. And what have the Swiss made in 500 years, right? A cuckoo clock, right?
It's like the little boy in Killing the Second Dog, who is this prankster constantly playing cruel tricks on people. But he seems like the only free, pure soul in the work. Another thing about this passage with the broken glass is that I think it characterizes Hłasko's method of using tension and release. There's always a pent-up desire for privacy, for completion, and the only way out of it is to do something that society doesn't have a rubric for.
Yeah, I think the transgression is quite interesting, and violence as the catharsis is a theme that comes back again and again in Hłasko. We see this also in the Israeli tales, right? Particularly the kind of cruelty that's sort of beyond the norm, that is transgressive, that is sadistic. Sadism becomes the way through which this character articulates himself, right? And of course, there's this masochistic, in the Israeli stories in particular, there's a masochistic self-othering, kind of becoming the victim, and then only to sort of transfer that energy to somebody else, right? So I find this notion of completion or incompletion to be a perfect metaphor for what was happening in the socialist Polish Republic to begin with, right? And then he moves with that towards a different kind of field in the exilic stories, where there are two men who actually need each other desperately, but who loathe one another, right? So this is sort of like a really strange mixture of compulsive attraction, but also disgust and contempt, which you see also already in the Polish stories, right? These people never just really fall in love. They fall in love despite or against each other, right? They are always charged against each other. It's never a simple kind of matter of yes, finding the room. That I don't think would be enough, right? Although that in itself is impossible, and that kind of structures the productive sort of, if you like, the libido of the story, right? The productive forces, and yeah, only violence, a kind of crazy release of violence is the way to move forward.
Let's take a look at some of those later novels from his Israeli period. In All Backs Were Turned, we've got a character named Dov Ben Dov, a tough Israeli and an ex-con, which means his father is also named Dov, and he has a little brother called Little Dov, or the other Dov. Dov Ben Dov has a sidekick named Israel, a Polish immigrant, and this is one of Hłasko's buddy narratives. Dov Ben Dov is this strong character both physically and in his personality, and Israel is the straight man. The story is one of repeated humiliations. The plot revolves around Little Dov, a fisherman, who is in competition with these other fishermen who have motorboats. And one of them, Yehuda, another tough guy, tries to pay Israel off to get Little Dov out of town. Israel turns down a big wad of cash, so Yehuda and his associates beat him up. Israel is an ex-con, so he can't fight back, or he'll get into trouble, and so will Dov Ben Dov, and they'll both go back to prison. It's another story of pent-up desire, now for revenge, to defend yourself. So at a certain point, he gets in an argument with a cafe owner who doesn't want to serve him because he's a former criminal. And Israel picks up a chair and smashes the guy's espresso machine in another moment of tension and release, which is what the whole war is about. There's an overwhelming power. First it's the Germans, and then it's the Soviets. and you can't do anything but fall into these outbreaks of displaced violence.
The violence is there. It's cathartic. It's the only thing really that can help, because memory, as the book, as Hłasko shows in the book, just gets in the way, right? Memories don't help. You cannot just get over these things, right? And there, right before that passage, actually, with the violence, there's this whole disquisition, almost a soliloquy about Germans, right? Germans and what the Germans have done and what God has planned for Germany. This is on page 72, 73, right? I thought maybe I'd read a short passage about this, because this recurs. The question of evil, right? Evil so great as to almost not have a name. And so the issue of Germany and Germans comes up. The character Israel, who was a student of aeronautics, aircraft construction, can't study this anymore. And there's always this like broken career because of exile, and also because of one's past. You can't get back to the thing that you really loved, right? But in this case, he says, well, I could maybe go to Germany, but Germany, and I start to quote here, Germany of all places, I never thought life would be so amusing, but thanks anyway. Do you hate Germans? No, he said, I pity them, but pity is worse than hate. What does one feel for people who murder children? Hate? I believe God has turned his back on Germans once and for all, and that he'll never show his face to them again and never punish them, even if they commit 1,000 new crimes in the future. That's not hate, right? So it's sort of beyond good and evil. There's this awful trauma that all the characters are trying to work through. The only way to forget about it is to commit other acts of violence, right? But this monumental trauma is always there. It sort of structures what they can and cannot do. Whether in All Backs Were Turned, or in Killing the Second Dog, right, or in some of the other stories that Hłasko wrote in Israel or about Israel. All these things, all this past, the past that's too heavy, the memories are too overwhelming. All that comes and kind of gets channeled through a very economical discourse, right? I have too many memories. I can't express them to you. I can only tell you what I've experienced, and let me destroy something, right? To kind of just get through the day. And that I think Freud would call that melancholy. You cannot really get through the morning.
Maybe that helps to explain this fascination with tough, masculine James Dean characters in mid-20th century Polish culture, like Dov Ben Dov from the novel, the actors Zbigniew Cybulski, Hłasko himself in his own self-portrayal, some of the characters in Leopold Tyrmann's Zły, or Evil, published in English as The Man with the White Eyes, and then the poet Edward Stachura in The Next Generation. It's as if society calls on these hyper-masculine characters with all their problems to overcome the original trauma of emasculation during the war, which becomes the ultimate trauma, literally, in All Backs Were Turned, following a series of figurative emasculations.
You cannot act. You have to sort of take it, right? There is really no way past that moment of crisis other than to engender another crisis. And I think, revenge, while it would be sweet, well, who do you enact the revenge on, right? And then what would that solve, right? So you have you have this notion, and Hłasko talks about this, that, he lived under the Nazis and saw atrocities, but then he lived under communists and saw other atrocities. And his conclusion is that by hunger, fear, terror, you can make any group of people do anything under the sun, and no group is better than any other, right? Does this mean that he forgave the Germans? Right? That's a very, very tough question, and nor should we really ask that question, right? It's really an impossible question to answer. But his entire oeuvre has this problematic idea of the German, and he also, I should maybe mention this in the context of of onomastics. He never refers to them as Nazis or Hitlerites. Hitlerites would have been the socialist way of talking about them. Nazis is how we do it here. It's always the Germans, right? It's Niemcy, 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 Germans, Germans, Germans. Even and if there are other Nazis, he also names them by nationality, right? For example, a scene with the Ukrainians who commit this atrocity against a girl in Warsaw during the uprising. But it's always the Germans. It's a particular way of maintaining a kind of memory and also control over the discourse, right?
Thinking back 2 episodes of Encounters with Polish Literature to our discussion of feminist novelist Zofia Naukowska, who addresses some of these same social issues around gender, and looking now at Hłasko describing these frustrated male figures, it's not as if Hłasko is just a victim of his era and isn't aware of the problem of women's marginalization and toxic masculinity. There's a moment in All Backs Were Turned where Little Dove's wife, Esther, says, "You're just like your brother. Neither of you has ever asked for my opinion. You love only each other. Dove loves Dove. Dove admires Dove, and Dove listens only to what Dove says. You need women only between 10 in the evening and 6 in the morning, and only for one reason, so you'll fall asleep more easily and dream of each other. But I shouldn't be telling you all that. I should be listening to what you're saying so that I can repeat it all later to my Dove and finally hold his attention." Hłasko's awareness of the problem doesn't exactly excuse it, but explains and complicates how we might read this behavior in the novel. So, how about in Killing the Second Dog? Maybe you can set that up.
This is a very theatricalized piece, very performative. It has 2 Polish emigres in Israel, one of them who's a Gentile, the other one who's a Jew, trying to survive and without really any kind of like real papers or any real plans, to try to survive through hustling, right? And this is sort of another transgression where kind of effectively confirming what Esther said in the other book, that men only need women between 10 and 6 p.m. and also for money, obviously, right? And the rest of the time, men are in love with each other in this very homosocial kind of toxic sort of relationship. So this is a story, a novel that you can't really read without looking at the picture of Hłasko from a beach in Tel Aviv, right by some like rental chairs or chaises, with a suntan and with a cigarette kind of cockily in his mouth. Hłasko, the almost like a cinematic kind of amant, right? The sort of lover from his screen is a tattoo. He's of course suntan and oiled, right? And so the theme of the novel is actually it's dual, right? One on the sort of the kind of level of the plot, right? There are various schemes of trying to separate not elderly, quite middle-aged women from money. It's kind of similar, in fact, to how Polanski's Knife in the Water works, right? There's definitely a sense of prey and predators. So these guys are predators. On the other level has to do with theater, right? This is all described as theater. It's performative. You're performing masculinity the same way as you're performing love. Everything is play, right? Everything is just a piece of an act, and it works well if you can separate the audience from their money, right? That's what good theater does, except for perhaps free theater. And here, the particular theater between these 3 figures is to separate the quarry from her inheritance or whatever money she has planned for the future. So it works quite well because the play has been performed before, and this is the second dog that's being killed. There was another dog that was killed, and the dog, the senseless killing of the dog, is the kind of climax of the story, right? Where in the English Jacob, right, the main character, out of impossible choices to go with the woman or to sort of enact his career, or isn't really able to know what to do, and because of the past that catches up with him, he kills the dog, therefore breaks her heart, right? That's the notion, and we know that's going to happen because it's already in the title, right? The dog has already been killed. Another dog has been selected and groomed for the job. The dog is also a player, effectively, right? Although one that can be the sacrificial lamb, if you like. But things don't go exactly how he imagines, right? First of all, he really kind of develops feelings for this woman, And two, he becomes so aware of the meta aspect of what he's doing, right? The sort of the performance of a performance, that he starts thinking about other elements of his identity that he's had to suppress. And so this book is really fascinating in that it's like a tug of war between trying to go on through with it and then the past catching up with you, the surfeit of memory. Why would you do a terrible thing to an innocent person when so many terrible things had been done to so many innocent people in the past? And you're like the hinge, this figure, Jacob, is the hinge between the past and the future, right? The tragic past and the sort of insane future that he's got cooked up for this person. And so it's really interesting how he's trying to negotiate this. So while the plot is a simple kind of seduction, it becomes much more complicated because of the past coming in, right? To really disable, I think I would say, right, the figure and make it impossible for him to go through with the con.
I think your idea of the surfeit of memory, that there's so much to remember that it can't be erased, is very interesting here.
This is really about authenticity as well. Who is this person? And in fact, you can extend this to who are the Poles, right? What have the Poles witnessed? What have we been part of? And how do we deal with that? It's almost like a work kind of bridging memory studies with post-memory, right? Because some of these things happened to a young Hłasko. Some of these things couldn't have happened to Hłasko, but probably happened to a generation of slightly older people, since Hłasko would have been 5 or 6 or 7 during these periods, right? But he sort of puts it all in here. There are 2 passages about the surfeit of memory and memory coming on, like erupting into, the daily life or this particular theater, that you just can't go through with it. So he says, I should have told her all this, but she probably wouldn't have believed me. I could have told her how I robbed someone when I was 15 and wasn't caught, and how 3 months later a friend and I robbed a ticket office at a train station. My friend was arrested, and I gave myself up so we could go to jail together because I enjoyed his company. But she wouldn't have believed me. Nor would she believe me if I told her I lost my virginity at the age of 12 to a ripe German girl on the day of her engagement to a young lieutenant. Nor would she believe me if I told her about the German soldier who set his dog on me and then started kicking me and broke my nose just because I wanted to play with the dog. It goes on. It would have been a relief to tell her everything. At least it would have been a relief to just tell her about the Jewish family hiding next door until they were murdered by the Germans, a man, a woman, and 3 children. When their bodies were lying on the ground, the Germans stopped some men walking by and ordered them to piss on the corpses. A German called me over, and I pissed too, shaking with fear, while the Germans photographed the living, profaning the dead. And it would have been a relief to tell her how one day when I was walking to school, the Germans blocked off the street and made us watch them hang people from balconies. No one moved or screamed, not those forced to watch, nor those who were being hung. I could also have told her about the Jewish mothers in 1943 who threw their babies into a raging fire, first lifting them high over their heads as if in a gesture of triumph, while Poles made funny remarks on the other side of the ghetto wall. But I think she would have asked me to shut up after my very first words. I try to tell these things to lots of people, but I don't think anyone ever listens seriously. Too much memory. Some of these memories seem like almost public memories. The 1943 scene reminds me of Campo dei Fiori, just from Miłosz's poem, and also the film Pokolenie, right? Wajda's Generation, which has the same scene effectively in it with the merry-go-round and the fire from the ghetto, right? So these are almost public memories, they're kind of collective memories. I'm not sure Hłasko was necessarily there, right? Or how he would have seen this, but it would have been seen and witnessed by others. The Germans make an appearance, cruel German kind of, crimes during the occupation. And all this proves to be too much, right? And nobody listens. Nobody's listening, right? You can listen as the reader, but the people in the stories are too busy with other things. So it's this Polish memory, right? This sort of Polish memory, the memory of witness, He's also mentioning collaboration, right, in other stories. Very heavy kinds of memories that really interrupt the daily task. It almost doesn't matter what the daily task is, right? And it sort of makes for a stranger kind of alienating reading experience to think that, well, he's thinking these things, these terrible, violent procession of almost surrealistically violent images as he's trying to seduce a woman he's going to ultimately con.
Hłasko sometimes introduces humor into these moments, but then it can take kind of a dark turn. There's that prankster character I mentioned earlier, the son of the woman who is the mark of the con game, and he plays these tricks that are both hilarious and cruel. So this scene is preceded by a discourse on fathers, recalling that Hłasko's own father, a prominent lawyer, divorced his mother when Marek was only 3 years old and then died in 1939, right before the war. This scene starts with a typical noir gesture. Time is marching along, and then there's a sudden interruption. So, the I speaking here is the character Jacob. Suddenly, we were jolted by a piercing scream. The woman's kid had thrown his ball at a man in a deck chair a few yards away. The man, dressed in khaki pants and a short-sleeved shirt, was quietly watching children splash around in the water. He had a sweet smile on his face, the kind of smile only a man who's never known the joys of fatherhood can have. But that smile belonged to the past now. The kid's ball had knocked the man's wig off his head, and his face was red with rage. He held his grayish hairpiece in his left hand, and his right was gripping the boy by the arm. People were shrieking with laughter. "Where's your father?" the man yelled. "I won't tell you," the kid said. I could see from his expression, even though his arm must have hurt terribly, that he was trying to be brave. "Oh, yes, you will. I won't." "You won't?" "No." When the man placed the kid across his knees to give him a good spanking, I stood up and went over. "Let him go," I said. "Stop molesting that child. Shame on you." "Is this your kid?" "Let him go," I said, pulling the kid out from the man's clutches. "You should teach him better manners." "Why? He's not my kid, just like that hair isn't yours. You should be ashamed." "He's not your kid?" "I don't think so. I've always wanted daughters only, like King Lear." Something awful bit my hand. When I looked down, I saw it was the kid. He met my gaze. Standing with his feet wide apart, he was getting ready to slug me. "Bug off, you sad creep," he said to me. "I can take care of myself." "See?" the wigless man said and nodded with satisfaction. "The way Americans bring up their kids." "Keep your cool, Sonny," I said to the kid. My hand was on fire. "Take your ball and go play somewhere else." The kid had a crew cut. If he hadn't, his hair would have stood on end from sheer anger. "Next time, mind your own bloody business," he told me. So, it's a farcical scene, but underlying it is the fact that the woman has brought the boy to Israel to meet his absent father. So maybe humor is another kind of recourse, like violence, that one has in the face of trauma.
Of course, this kind of humor is not without a victim. So there are always new victims that the ground becomes littered with victims, real and metaphorical, right? Even this kind of humor, which you see elsewhere in the book, right? There are all kinds of things said about shorter people, right? There's a little person who's being sort of mocked for his deformity. There are all kinds of ways in which Hłasko can be mean, right? You earlier mentioned objectifying women, right? There are sort of very strong passages about that too. It's like for the moment, he's saying the woman, his Mark. I'm just gonna paraphrase. She's still somebody that men might look at, but in a few years, the gays will actually find another interest. Nobody will look at her. Nobody will listen to them. Their voices will kind of become shrill, and they'll just disappear. They will literally disappear as though they had never existed at a moment when men become truly, quoting here, handsome and mature, right? So this very subjective or objectivizing gaze has a cruelty too, because it's an expiration date, right? So in addition to all that, there's also ageism thrown in. So I should probably say that, there are passages that haven't aged so well in these novels, right? There is misogyny. There is this sort of homosocial type of very close set of relationships that can always spill into violence. There are many ageist comments.
Thinking again about my discussion with Ursula Phillips 2 episodes back, Zofia Naukowska is everywhere obsessed with the aging woman's body. But Ursula read a very interesting passage from the novel Boundary, which I recommend to our viewers, where the main character, Elżbieta, who is being raised by her Aunt Cecilia, is attending a gathering of her aunt with a group of her aunt's friends. And at first, Elżbieta finds them grotesque, describing them, their double chins, in graphic physical terms. And then she realizes that, well, they were once like her, and she will be like them one day. So she comes to admire them for their forthrightness about their husbands' infidelities and all their hardships. Hłasko perhaps doesn't live long enough to have that kind of recognition.
I mean, that's kind of a cult of the body beautiful, right? I thought I would maybe read a very short passage from Eighth Day of the Week, in which Agnieszka is describing her own father, right? And it's again this, and of course, since there's no space, everybody's walking around and they're like in their underclothes, right? So and sort of showing all the folds and other imperfections. And so he comes up to her and says, do I look my 55 years? Right. So I mean, I'm 50, and so that's already old, right? I'm guessing. So he moved his face closer to hers, and she felt his unhealthy, sour breath. That's on page 56. He looked far older. He was creased, bald. His skin was flecked with liver spots, and there were heavy bags under his eyes. He was ruined. What is called ruined by the war, by discomfort, by poor food. His muscular body, strong as an animal's, contrasted with his aged face. She looked at him for a time. He reminded her of a poor old dog. She averted her eyes and burst out laughing. And then, of course, she tells him a white lie. You look no more than 45. But, the ruined bodies, of course, go very well with the ruined cities. And how can you build anything with this sort of, with the ruins all around you?
There's a story, Searching for Stars, translated by Ross Ufberg for Tablet Magazine, November 20th, 2014. And this is Hłasko at his best, his most economical in his prose, like an O. Henry story in which nothing is insignificant. So, as we were planning today's meeting, you said you found this to be Hłasko's most affecting work.
So the story is, again, autobiographical, but in the third person. The main character is a boy, 9 years old. If it's actually a Hłasko figure or stand-in, then the year would be 1942 or 43. Since he was born in January 1934. So this is the sort of the beginning of the final solution, right? It's also the middle of the occupation of Poland, right? 41, 42. And there's a boy who's unnamed. He's in love with a girl, sort of prepubescent love, right? Without desire, just curiosity, who's 8, and her name is Eva. And she's described as darker. That's the kind of trope in Polish literature. The dark eyes, darker skin is sort of a signifiers of Jewish people, right? And we learn that quite quickly that, she can't come out during the day. They can only see each other in the evening. The father, our boy's father, seems to be in the resistance. He's saying, like, look, you have to be very careful hanging out with this kid, friend of yours. And there's another family who seem to be in a shorthand, working for the Germans. This is a quote from the story. So they're collaborationists, right? So we have these three main protagonists, if you like, or sort of actors. We have the Jewish family that's hiding. We have the boy and his family who are Poles, right? Whose father is in the AK. Armia Krajowa, I'm guessing, would have been the resistance at that time. And then there is the family, Nadera family, who are collaborationists, and they're profiting and benefiting from discovering hidden Jewish families or individuals. And so it's told from the boy's perspective. You have to fill in the blanks yourself until the final scene, where it turns out that the Nadera people have reported where Eva and her family were hiding, which brings us then actually kind of intertextually to a scene in The Second Dog, that I read earlier, where there's a Jewish family who was discovered and executed. And that's what's going to be happening here, right? Eva is discovered. Eva and her family are discovered. This happens during the night. The Gestapo, I'm guessing, comes and discovers them. And again, from a 9-year-old boy's perspective, there's just the Germans, right? So to set up the quote, it's a longer passage. It's actually the last passage where everything happens, but it's unnamed. I will tell you this. So there is a Polish policeman. There's the Germans who are probably Gestapo officers. There is the family of the 9-year-old boy. And then there's Eva and her family, right? And so this is sort of this tableau, a scene. We learned a little bit earlier, before the passage I'm going to read, that all night the peasant and the father, Eva's father, were digging a hole, right? So we're going to have an execution, because that's why holes were dug in the middle of the night, right? You dug your own grave, effectively. So it also turns out, again, connecting to hiding the second dog, killing the second dog, that everybody's going to have to see this scene of the execution, right? That this is not going to be just a kind of a nameless act of the Holocaust. This is going to be public. These are the orders. The policeman said reluctantly, we were told that everybody has to watch for an example. They walked behind the policeman and the Germans. His mother was still holding his arm, and the boy was embarrassed. He tried to free himself once and a second time, but his mother was holding him tightly. He regretted his father wasn't there. His father would never do such a thing. And his father has disappeared into the forest, right? He's hiding. He's gone into to meet his crew, his companions. His father would never do such a thing. At most, he'd lay a hand on his shoulder, and they simply looked like two friends returning home after work. They stood then and watched as Eva's father and the peasant whose house they were living in dug a ditch, working quickly and silently. He saw Eva, whose mother held her by the hand, just like his mother, and he lurched toward her, but his mother was stronger than he was. He stood and watched. He saw how one of the Germans walked over to the crying Eva and stroked her head. "Don't cry, sweetie," he said. "Do you know who we are?" "Who?" said Eva. "We are the star searchers," he said. "We're searching for the yellow stars." "Bring her a doll," he said to the policeman. "A doll?" The policeman said, surprised. "Yes," said the German, "something to entertain her." The policeman walked into the house and came after a minute holding a stuffed teddy bear. "How old is she?" the German asked Eva's mother. 8. The German gave her the bear, and Eva stood now with a stuffed animal in her hand. "Well," he said, "don't be afraid. Do you know the fairy tale about the wolf and the 7 baby goats? No? One time Mama Goat said to her kids, 'Don't open the door for anybody when I'm not home.' And she left. Then the wolf came and knocked his paw on the door. 'Who's there?' asked the little goat. And he said, 'It's me, your grandmother.' 'Then why do you have such a low voice, Grandma?' asked the little goat. The policeman walked up to him and said, 'It's ready. Do they have to undress?' 'No,' said the German. The policeman reached out his hand to Eva. 'Give me the bear, sweetheart,' he said. 'Why take it away from her?' the German said. 'I wanted it for my child,' said the policeman. 'But you see, she's also a child,' said the German. 'You're a strange man. You ought to be ashamed of yourself.' Then there's a break. They walked home, and the boy, crying, was glad his mother had been with him, not his father. Because in front of his father, he would have been ashamed to cry, and he had to cry, and there was nothing to do about it. During the following days, the partisans killed Nadera and his oldest son. A young man shot the German on the station platform in clear daylight, and a Jewish family committed suicide by putting their necks to the train tracks at night. The boy knew all of this. He heard about all of it, and he slowly forgot. But sometimes he cried. At those times when he remembered that he would never have a wife and children because he had already sworn to be faithful, and that he was in love for the rest of his life. The shame of witness, and of course the shame of collaboration that sets this whole thing into motion.
Right. The boy may have felt responsible for the discovery because he was making a deal with Nadera's son to trade some chicken coops, and Nadera's son came over while Eva was there. And then the boy and Nadera get into a fight, and now the young Nadera is seeking revenge, which he can get by telling his father, the collaborator.
Yes, there's that possibility. Just sets a chain of events into motion, right? The unsaid, of course, is really the power of the story, right? Those moments, those lacunae, those gaps, right? Like what happened? Why is he crying? And why will he never have a wife and children? Why is he so faithful? Why is he so ashamed? The word shame. If I haven't done this, but it would be a really interesting exercise to look for shame, to be ashamed throughout Hłasko's oeuvre. I bet you it's one of the most common words, right? One of the commonest feelings, most common feelings. Then the other thing about the story, which I find like really extraordinary in terms of memory studies, is the Holocaust object, right? The bear, the little bear. Who does the bear belong with? The bear will obviously be buried with Eva, right? And it's just kind of extraordinary to watch this bear change hands and be kind of fought over, right? As if it was anything valuable. And yet these lives are about to be lost. And how come we don't see that? I mean, how come the characters can't see that? The Polish policeman, like, he wants the bear for his kid. So then the bear will become part of the burial, right, with the family. And it's Eva's bear now.
Maybe this wasn't discussed so openly at the time the story was written, but Hłasko raises the question of the policeman, who may be forced to work for the Nazis, but he's also in it for himself, right? He wants Eva's bear for his own child. We see it in Miłosz's poems, Campo dei Fiori, A Poor Christian Looks at the Ghetto, the guilt of the survivors, but also the guilt of those who may have profited from the Holocaust. And Hłasko is aware of it.
The post-Jewish property, mienie pożydowskie, right? I mean, even before this family is dead, you can already take the property effectively, right? And the law is on your side effectively because these figures are homini sacri, right? They no longer have any rights, right? They're going to be killed. So yeah, I teach this text actually in my Intro to Polish Culture class, and I'm actually very thankful that Russ translated it, because it's very, very early to be doing this kind of memory work. It's 1963, and it's, as you said, it's sort of approachable. You don't need to know who these figures are or what will happen. The story kind of tells us the discourse of the Holocaust as it tells a story of a Holocaust tragedy, right? It sort of narrates itself as a kind of history almost, right? So it's quite the tale. I hope more people read it.
Before we go, could you say a few words about the Polish program at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign?
We are inside the Slavic department, the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures. We offer a minor and a major. We collaborate closely with several other programs in the humanities, particularly the program in comparative and world literature, but also the program in Jewish culture and society, as well as the Russian, East European, and Eurasian Center, and now also the European Union Center. So students can take courses in all these programs and get credit. We also have a graduate program. I've had a number of master's students and PhD students have come through the program, doing both Polish and comparative literature with Polish components in it. There is a large collection of Polish materials at the library. We have a big collection. And of course, there's also a number of social clubs that students can get involved in particular, the Zagłoba Polish Club.
It's a program with a lot of context, and the UIUC library is particularly known for having the largest Slavic collection in the United States, with a research service and a summer workshop for researchers who may not be even at UIUC.
It's an excellent resource. There's a summer lab. There are the second Slavic language collections, which are very, very good. Slavic Review is also published here at the university, so that's yet another Slavic connection. And Polish Review is printed by the University of Illinois Press. So it kind of brings it all home.
I want to thank you so much for joining me here on Encounters with Polish Literature to discuss the work of Marek Hłasko.
Thank you very much, David. Thanks so much. Thank you for all you do.
I'd like to remind our viewers to remember to subscribe. Click the bell to receive notifications about new videos from the Polish Cultural Institute, New York. Go to the Polish Cultural Institute, New York's website, linked in the description down below, to see a full schedule of upcoming episodes. I'd like to thank all of the people who helped to make this series possible. Our sponsor, the Polish Cultural Institute, New York, directed by Robert Czaniawski. Bartek Remisko, head of Humanities and Literature at the Polish Cultural Institute New York, suggested this series and acts as our executive producer. My fellow producer, Natalia Iudin, handles all the video editing, the technical and aesthetic aspects of this production. Klaudia Ofłona-Draber, head of communications at the Polish Cultural Institute New York, keeps us all informed about upcoming episodes of Encounters with Polish Literature and other events organized by the Polish Cultural Institute New York. Thank you all for listening and reading along with us. Let's meet again in a month, when we'll be taking a look at the Polish School of Reportage, or long-form journalism, beginning with figures like Ryszard Kapuściński, and thriving as one of the most productive genres of Polish literature today. My guest will be Beth Holmgren from Duke University. See you then.